Namaskar, viewers. I am Payel Chowdhury,
Yes, namaskar.
and I am welcoming all of you to the launch of Catharsis, a poetry collection by bureaucrat, novelist, and poet Mukul Kumar. Mukul belongs to the 1997 batch of Indian Railway Traffic Service. At present, he is posted in Delhi. He did his humanities from Delhi University and Masters in Philosophy from Indian Institute of Public Administration, Delhi. He received a Bharat Nirman Award for Literary Excellence in this year 2020. With us, we have two eminent poets, and it's my proud privilege to welcome both our guests. A well-known poet and critic, Sukrita Paul Kumar was born and brought up in Kenya. She held the Aruna Asam in Delhi University till recently. Formerly a fellow of the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla, she was an invited poet at the International Writing Program, Iowa, USA, and Hong Kong Baptist University. Honorary faculty, General Center at Poetry. She has been a recipient of many prestigious fellowships and residencies. Her recent collections of poems are Country Drive, Dreamcatcher, Untitled, and Poems Come Home with Hindustani translations by Gulzar. Amongst her critical books are Narrating Partition and Conversations in Modernism. Her translations include the book Nude, Poems by Vishal Bhardwaj, and the novel Blind. A guest editor of journals such as Manova Hawaii and Muse India, she has held exhibitions of her paintings. Many of her poems come out of her experience of working with the homeless, the street children, and tsunami victims. I welcome Sukrita ma'am to the event.
Thank you.
Sahitya Academy winner for Doipa and Roder Dhare, Subodh Sarkar, an eminent Bengali poet, has published 35 books of poems in 40 years. As a Fulbright Fellow, he taught at the University of Iowa, USA. Currently, he is the president of West Bengal Kobita Academy, the first of its kind in the country. He teaches in City College, Calcutta University, Kolkata. Welcome, sir.
Namaskar. Thank you. Thank you, Payel.
Sir, it is the second time we are welcoming you for Mukul's book launch. The first was his debut fiction, As Boys Become Men, in Kolkata. And this is the second time. So I welcome once again.
Yeah.
The crown of literature is poetry, William Somerset Maugham says. And I have had the privilege and the opportunity to read and select the poems for this book, Catharsis, and edit the manuscript. So this poem book is a collection of Mukul's sensibilities towards his own life and the world that surrounds him. So I congratulate Mukul on the 4th publication. Irrepressible Echoes was his first anthology of English poems in 2012. Congratulations, Mukul. And I will request you to speak about the book and the genesis of Catharsis, and if you can recite a few poems from your book.
Thank you, Payel. At the outset, let me express my deep gratitude to Madam Sukrita Paul Kumar and Shri Subodh. Two poets of such eminence have agreed to do the honors. It's a really, it's a sheer privilege for me. And coming to the book, this Catharsis, I think it is my second, poetry collection. The first one was Irrepressible Echoes. And this poem basically consists of a few of the poems from the earlier anthology also, and few new poems which I written over all these years. I think last 7-8 years. So that is how this collection has come out. And basically, I had been writing for the last 3-4 years. I had been writing predominantly fiction, but poetry remains my first love, and I never left poetry. And whenever I got the knocks of poetry at my heart, I immediately grabbed those calls, and some poetry came out of me. You have asked me to recite a few poems. I would like to recite a couple of poems, and my first poem which I am going to recite is Epiphany. Epiphany I would like to share that when I finished this poem and I reflected on this poem, I was reminded of the quote of William Butler Yeats, when he says that when you quarrel with yourself, poetry comes out. When you argue with others, when you quarrel with others, it is the rhetoric which is produced. And as ma'am in her blurb has very aptly brought out that this poem is confessional in nature. And it tends to reflect a bit of, it's quite personal. It tends to reflect my life also as such, my worldview of life and humanity. So here is the poem, Epiphany. I will attain what I want, no matter how big the hurdles there to daunt. And where have I ever suffered any withdrawal? I am an ardent practitioner of dharma and treat destiny as a function of karma. I set off with my usual elan, convinced that I am not a flash in the pan. I try but fail. I try again, but only to fail. I try again and again and again. But this time, all the trials go in vain. Am I wearied and is my journey terminated? I am frustrated and dejected. My philosophy is challenged and self-belief jeopardized. I am plunged into entropy. Instead, is karma the function of destiny? Askance I look, caught up in this enemy, left yearning for the right philosophy. Intellect again rises to the rescue, shearing the poet from the sufferer. Never is absolute a single truth or philosophy. Finally, I glow up with the epiphany. That is how this poem ends. It starts with with poet quarreling with himself and ends at reconciliation. And that moment of reconciliation is, what the epiphany denotes in this particular poem. Second poem, which I would like to recite, is titled A Fatuous Frenzy. This poem has basically been inspired by the philosophy of Advaita Vedanta, which professes that soul is ultimately born of the super soul, and that way the entire humanity belongs to a single entity, that is super soul, Brahma, eternity, whatever, God, whatever we call it. And here I'm trying to visualize God as someone, God or Brahma as someone who is just who is out to wear different identities, because we are ultimately we belong to a single identity, that is super soul, and that Brahma is trying to wear different identities over the cycle of life and birth. So here's the poem, Life, a Fatuous Frenzy. I am the volume transfigured out of the whole of the ethereal spirit thriving in this garb. Set afloat is the garb with a vigor and fury known in the child, in possession of the cherished. It inexhaustibly unfurls itself, displaying all its colors and contours, amassing pride and plaudits in a state of frenzy. Alas, if this fatuous frenzy were just not an ephemeral import sucked out to replenish the frenzy of the whole for sporting identities. The image which is coming out that after death, that soul is again going back to the super soul, and that is how that super soul keeps getting replenished. And ultimately, when man is born, again that elements come from the super soul. That is how this poem has come out. Thank you, Payel. I think a couple of poems at this juncture is quite sufficient, because I would love to listen to two great poets reflecting on my poetry.
Yes. How would you respond to the poems which Mukul just recited? Can we just talk about the aesthetics and the poetics of the poems?
Did you address me?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. I asked you.
All right. Sorry, I missed out on that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So first of all, I think I would like to extend my congratulations to Mukul. I think it's fantastic to be taking these inward journeys. And when I look at, I got to know Mukul a few years ago when I think we happened to meet at some festival, literary festival.
And festival in Imphal.
Yes. So I think the impact that he had on my mind was that of, being a fiction writer. And never did I think of him as a poet. And so this came as a surprise to me when the book was, when he sent me his poems and said that, well, this is his second collection that he's coming out with. So congratulations on this, because I think there is a duality that particularly a fiction writer getting into writing poetry and a poet and the poet in you getting awakened in a particular way, there is a mutuality between the two forms. And as I also said in my foreword to your book, what I believe is that just as your writing fiction will get strengthened with your exercise in writing poetry, it's also the other way around. Because I think one form supports the other. And in fiction, you will get your interiority in as far as writing is concerned. And when you write poetry, I think there is a narrative style that one develops, even if it's not a narrative style as such, but there is a sequencing of ideas, as it were. Like one says, okay, this happened, and then that happened, and there is a certain amount of sequencing that you indulge in terms of even if it is the description of a character, and also you bring in a little bit of the element of a plot, a little bit of an introduction character, and so on. So there is narrativity that sort of you begin to develop in a like you have done in the poem Mr. Das, I think, in your collection. You can make out that this is a fiction writer who's writing this poem. And similarly, when you come to the other poems, even the poem that you just read out, Epiphany, I think there is a certain kind of, it's a different kind of a poem, because there you become confessional, there is an interiority, and there is an inward journey. To me, not that fiction is not inward, fiction also can be inward, but fiction I always see as more of an external, I mean, there's an external part of you, which is you as an author in relation to the society, in relation to the universe, and there are characters populating fiction, and so on. And of course, the narrator's voice is strong enough because it's the author, you're also narrating. But definitely in poetry, what happens is that you're taking these inward journeys, and there is greater scope in a way for reflection in one sense. And there is a depth that you evolve eventually. And that depth is very important. Whether you, even if it is just an exercise in writing poetry, I think it's a very valuable tool to have, to be able to write poetry, to be able to see how much of a dip you can take inside yourself. And that dip that one needs to, or dive that you have to take inside yourself, I think is what really creates poems like, for instance, your poem called A Beggar. I think it's a very good poem. And, the images that come up in that, for instance, the stones, the clanging of the stones in the bowl, that's something that stays with you eventually, because it's sound, it's very sensuous. The poem becomes very sensuous because it deals with sound, smell, touch, feel, and then ultimately, usually if a poem is good, you say, poem touched, That's the impact of a poem. The intensity that comes out of a poem, writing of a poem, is definitely related to the kind of dive that you take within yourself, which doesn't mean that it becomes very narrowly subjective, but it's a reality within yourself that one begins to explore, because this reality within yourself obviously has to contain the outside. It's not as if there is a divorce between the inside and the outside, but the outside is internalized. And in this process of internalization, something beautiful happens, because ultimately this internalized reality also begins to find expression outwardly. And that is why it becomes a poem. Because words have to be used as a kind of a tool then. And if you don't know that tool, if you don't know how to use that tool, your expression is going to collapse, right? So you have to know the tool as well. Just like a carpenter has to know how to use the saw, how to use the wood that he has. So the medium words are very, very important. The skill is very important, but it has to be balanced out with the inspiration that one has. And I think those moments when you get inspiration, which are captured through your expression in poetry, if that is not there, no matter how much of perspiration that you might have to, you may have to sweat it out, but if that flash is not there, if that inspirational quality is not there, then it's going to be a total failure, a poem. So I think it's a very nice thing as a bureaucrat to see a bureaucrat writing poetry. I mean, there's a contradiction in terms. I always feel that. But I'm glad that it is, because it will keep you in a very balanced way, human and you to be a human, feel your heart throb inside yourself and make other people's hearts throb by the way you are able to put together. And this is an ongoing journey, my dear. You will have to struggle very hard. It's not as if first book or second book or third book, you may write 50 books and yet you may not be a successful poet. Unless that struggle and engagement remains to be inside you. And I hope that you're a senior bureaucrat. You will never be a senior poet. A poet has to be forever innocent like a child and very imaginative and very, very, and not a teacher. Because if you start explaining things in your poem, then it ceases to be a poem. So there is no need for that. But even if the flashes of images come in, how do you connect one image with the other? It's an ongoing journey. We are condemned then to write poetry, I'd say. But this condemnation ultimately comes out of suffering, but ultimately leads to flashes of bliss, which you lose out again and you want to go and write another poem. So this is an ongoing journey, and welcome to the club. And keep writing, and never try to find any kind of shortcut to what you might call success. Success and writing, they are in contradiction to each other. Failures produce better poetry. As a bureaucrat, you have to be successful. But as a poet, no. If you begin to feel you are successful, then you're going to be smug, ultimately going into arrogance. So remain humble, humane, and committed, and then be proud to write a poem. Have self-respect because of that. Sorry, I'm turning out to be a teacher myself out here, but this comes out of my struggle, my exercise of perpetually engaging in writing. And even sometimes when I have to paint, when I feel like painting, and I end up writing a poem, I'm doing something to the words, I believe, which create images as though it is a painting. So there is a mutuality there also between one kind of art and another, just as I was talking about your fiction and your poetry. All the best to you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Payel, here Payel, I'm tempted to share something here. Ma'am was talking about how a bureaucrat is writing poetry. I think ma'am, I wrote a poem, Bureaucrat Searches for the Poet, and that brings out the clash between the sensibilities of a bureaucrat and a poet. And there, I think I could so palpably feel it. How that poem ends up defining a bureaucrat and ends up defining poetry itself. And that juxtaposition, I think, that carries through the poem, and that poem remains very dear to my heart. That is one.
Lovely.
Okay, Payel,
Yeah.
thank you.
Subodh sir, you have read Mukul's fiction, the first fiction as Boys Become Men, and now Mukul stands in front of you as a poet. So your comments on his poems and the writer and the fiction writer and the poet Mukul. Sir, to you. Sir, to you.
Thank you, Payel. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, sir.
We can.
Yeah, congratulations, To Mukul, I'm
Thank
so
you, sir.
happy to see you again. I'm really proud of you. I still remember you as a very young writer came to Calcutta. We had a book launch, and I was very happy to be there at the book launch event at Oxford Bookstore on Park Street in Calcutta,
Yes, sir.
which was a fantastic book launch event because um, we had an hour-long session after the launch was over. I still remember over over tea and coffee at the bookstore.
The
It was
tea-
fantastic.
the tea-
But now this time it's a book launch event without touching the book, without touching each other. And it's such difficult to understand. Is it a book launch or something else? I don't know. But when as Sukrita, she was talking about the book and also about Mukul as poet and as fiction writer, and also as a bureaucrat. So we came to realize slowly that yes, we are talking about a book, we are talking about the poems, we are talking about the poet, and it's about a book. And now we have to imagine that yes, we are at the book launch, and it's really at the very beginning I was really confused. Is it going to be a book launch or something else? But now we have, it's a new normal. Now we have to accept it. Yes, it's a book launch event, um, and we are talking about the book. The first thing that comes to my mind, as Sukrita ji was also talking about it, um, Mukul, I have no problem, whether a bureaucrat can write poems or not. We have solved this, enigma long before, because in India, we have a tradition of bureaucrats writing poems. And this tradition is very rich in Odisha, especially in Odisha, because we have top bureaucrats as poets, or poets as top bureaucrats. I can name, for example, Ramakanta Ratho, Shitakanta Ratho. We don't have many examples in Bengal, and in Bengal also we have a kind of, um, uh, we don't want to see the bureaucrats as poets. I don't know why. But 50, 60 years ago, we had top bureaucrats like Annoda Shankar Ray. Um, he was ICS, and he was a poet, he was a fiction writer, he was eminent essayist, and also a top bureaucrat. In Hindi, from among the living poets, we have Ashok Bajpayee and others. And even in south of India, we have a lot of bureaucrats writing as poets, writing as fiction writers. Even in English tradition, we have bureaucrats. In Indian English writing, we have bureaucrats writing fiction, writing poetry. So I think that in India, in modern India, rather I should say in postmodern India, we have the examples of bureaucrats writing literature, writing or practicing paintings, or they're singers or musicians or filmmakers. They can be anything. So, what is my point is that a poet is a poet is a poet. It doesn't matter what is his profession. It doesn't matter that he is a professor. Why we always choose to think that that a poet must be a teacher, a professor, or a journalist? I don't know. A banker can be a poet. I think that from a poet has no problem. We don't know who is going to be poet in this world. A carpenter can be a poet. A vagabond can be a poet. A great wise man can be a poet. A sant, most of the saints in medieval India were poets. If you just think about Tukaram, a great poet who modernized Marathi language. You just imagine 450 years ago, He was murdered at the age of 32, and what he left behind was the archive for the modern Marathi people, and they learned how to write poetry. So I believe that they learned from Tukaram how to write poetry. So I believe that this contradiction, if there is any, and this contradiction is good for a poet. We live in contradictions. We don't live always in equations. Contradiction is very important, for me at least, and also for Mukul, I believe, as I have understood his poetry. And also, this is how, one life is hyphenated with another. And the way Mukul writes poetry, I think, as for example, this book, I have not read this book thoroughly because I didn't get, the book. And I always like to read, to feel, to touch the page, and to smell the book and read. Otherwise, I can't. I'm not. I'm a bad reader on internet, online. I'm a bad reader. But I always like physical books. I like to touch it. I like to smell it, and then I am able to go through it. But still, I have some poems in my memory, especially the one that I really like, Mukul. And Payel, I think that you have also liked this poem, because we also talked about this. The poem is called I Mate Horizon. In this poem, it's beautiful to see that how a bureaucrat, there is no reference to any profession, but this is how we can understand the speaker of the poem and how he is melting into the vastness of the horizon as a small child. This is exactly what Sukrita ji was talking about. A poet is like a child with all his innocence and possibly his wisdom. Sometimes I believe that a child is possibly the wisest of all and the most innocent. If there is a kind of blend, innocence and wisdom, innocence and experience, as to quote William Blake, there is both. On one hand you have the innocent, on the other you have the experience. This is how a poet goes through. So here we have both the child and the adult together in this poem, I Mate Horizon. I'm tempted to quote one, the opening lines. It's beautiful. Horizon is always a mirage, seen but never made. This is exactly what we want to, read in a poem. Something that is seen but never made. Is it mirage? Or maybe it is my inner voice, or maybe it is my inner self. We don't know. It's as Sukrita ji was also talking about this inward journey. It's a horizon is the outside, but the outside is internalized. He is talking about the mirage. Mirage, is a beautiful thing. But it also is there inside. It's not always outside. So in a way, I find that Mukul, in this poem and also in other poems, he has beautifully blended. It's a mingling of innocence and experience in his poems. And in some other poems, he has also talked about the great Indian tradition. He's talked about Vedanta, great philosophy, and also about Indian philosophy. I have, when I was reading this poem, I have a feeling, that when we talk about the finest of words, when you talk about the finest of feelings, the most sublime of us, the most divine sparks that we long for, So when we talk about the finest poetry, I find the examples of finest poetry, if you have them before you, you find that poetry is always processing a kind of a machinery to rescue poetry from philosophy, from wisdom, from knowledge, from information. It's a touch, a smell, just a small little emotion, not a great emotion of revolution or something like that. I'm not talking about revolution. Even in the process of revolution, we have a lot of smiles, a lot of tears, a lot of sadness, a lot of revolts, and we have poetry out of it. So when Pablo Neruda talks about poetry, or when he writes about his own self, his love, as for example, tonight I can write the lines, sad. Tonight I can write the saddest lines. Write, for example, the night is starry and she is not with me. Someone is singing in the distance. Someone is singing. That's it's a small feeling. And that makes a great poem. He's not talking about the great things. Not a monument of feelings, human feelings, but a small tilt, a small heave, or just a small kind of, a feeling that is almost unexperienced, as if that has first come out in the poetry and the poet is experiencing. That has also, this is how on I will be happier to have more and more poetry from you, and less and less fiction from you. But I'm not saying I don't believe in this this demarcation between fiction and poetry. Yeah, but I hope that we both, I mean Sukrita ji and I, we are welcoming you to the club of
Yes.
Indian poets, and
Yes.
and we want more poetry from you. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Hello. Before we end this session,
Yes.
Am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
Before we end this session, there is one question.
Payel, I have a request. Payel, can you hear me? Payel, I have a request.
Yes, I can
Would
hear
you please ask? Yeah, would you please ask Mukul to read out a couple of poems?
Yes, definitely. Why not? I'm sure Mukul is impatient to read a few. But before he begins reading, one question I want to ask Mukul. For the last 3-4 years, I'm working on his manuscripts, editing and all. There is one phrase which Mukul uses quite often, that melancholy serves me well. So I have read that William Wordsworth says that it is the free flow of expressions and you recall the emotions in tranquility. But Mukul always emphasizes on melancholy. Why is it so, Mukul? Is melancholy the most...
But his railway department will be shocked to know that he writes about melancholy, and he says that melancholy serves him well. It's really, I don't know, but he's really writing about me.
Yes.
Payel, before reflecting on melancholy, I would like to thank you, sir, for his kind wishes and precious words. And poetry, I fully agree with you, sir, that poetry has got a very a transcendental quality. It translates everything, philosophy, or wisdom, or knowledge, information. I think you have raised a very pertinent issue, and that is why poetry is reckoned to be the most sublime genre of literature. And Payel at the outset tell why poetry is called the crown of literature. I fully agree with that. And it is the rhythmical creation of beauty. Poetry you can define as rhythmical creation of beauty. The beauty in itself is is an end when you write a poem. Coming to melancholy, melancholy serves me because that is an inherent condition which I find in me, and that gives me ample pleasure also. As Victor Hugo says that melancholy is the happiness of being sad, is the state of happiness where the happiness comes from sadness. And I fully identified with this view of Victor Hugo. When I say melancholy, it is not sadness. I always distinguish melancholy from sadness. Sadness can be born of certain material conditions, certain circumstances around you in life, but melancholy can be an inherent condition, and that always has stimulated creativity in me. And why I look at melancholy with a lot of anticipation, whenever I am in that state, my creativity gets stimulated, something comes out of me. The moment that I find myself in that state, I throb with anticipation that okay, something is going to come out. And as Sir has said, and I have titled this collection Catharsis, because catharsis is that particular emotion when you give vent to your emotions and you experience that kind of pleasure which is simply incomparable. Sublime is the only word which again comes to my mind.
The only danger, can I butt in here? The only danger is that when you put this into the category of sublime, then the problem is that, one doesn't see, as I think Subodh mentioned it very well, the ordinary and the small things, the small matters and small things in life, how do they touch a poet's heart? How do you pick that to make it like, yeah, it probably gets to become sublime because of the sense of beauty. And I would just like to tell you that, in my case, perhaps, I agree with you. This whole question of melancholy is very important. I would not call it, for myself, I don't call it melancholy. I call it, when I'm in the moment of writing, when I'm in the process of writing, then I think there's this dive that I have into a certain kind of a void. And there is a tremendous amount of loneliness, as it were. And you want to connect with yourself. It's almost like, you have distanced yourself from something very essential within yourself. And then how do you connect that? The connection happens through the process of writing poetry then. And then that is where you are dealing or engaging with probably what you're calling melancholy. And I call it a dive into myself. And then into that, when I get into that, then I can even kill myself. I can kill myself. But fortunately, I don't do that, and I write poetry. It's like that. It's like that. So go ahead.
And from this purview of melancholy, I can't leave out sensitivity. When you are sensitive, this is my own experience. When you are quite sensitive of the emotional, you have an emotional bent, then you will have that inherent condition, because it is called being a poet is a condition. It is not a profession. It's being in a certain condition. When you are sensitive, when you are emotional, you will have an natural eye for such sight, for such experiences, which bring out the softer and the finer sides of man. Like, ma'am, I will again refer to this poem Beggar. Like, not everybody will have an eye to catch that particular side. That is how you make use of those sides, those experiences, when you are in a certain state. That is where melancholy served me so well. And every poet, every writer has its own way of defining the state of that creativity. It can be melancholy, it can be sensitivity, as ma'am, is telling, is an inward journey, talking to yourself, going within yourself. I think it is also mixed up. So it's very difficult.
Mukul, just one thing. I'm tempted by your words to just to quote one line. I believe that for you and for many of us, melancholy is a way to introspection. It's a way to introspection. And there was a line in my Bengali poetry, in one of my Bengali poems, that the line says like this, something like this. Just it came to my head. Long ago I wrote, I am happy to be melancholy. So the point is, a beauty is incomplete without melancholy. So it's a part of our existence. You have beautifully spoken about melancholy, and I really appreciate it. We need it as we need happiness.
I would like to conclude, Payel, by saying, I think Dr. Kalam said, I think most probably he is the person who made this statement that poetry is born either of highest happiness or the deepest sorrows. But in my case, let me confess here that it is invariably that melancholy which gives rise to poetry. Never could I write a poem when I have felt extremely happy. Events of events which can really make a man happy. That way, I'm a proponent of melancholy. Yeah.
So is it that all the poets are?
I really wonder. You were so handsome and you were melancholy. That also gives us the answer. It's a way to introspection.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
So this is the book Catharsis. It has been published by Author Press, and the beautiful design of this book has been done by Prakhyat Roy. Thanks to the publisher and the designer of the book for bringing out this publication. And thank you, Sukrita ma'am. Thank you, Subodh sir, for joining us for this beautiful event. And it was indeed a privilege for me, and I'm sure it was for Mukul as well, to listen to the stalwarts who are eminent poets. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Payel. Thank you, Payel.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Payel.
Stay well, stay happy, stay safe. And yes, Mukul, you want to
not only listening to these poets, these great poets, but they agreeing to bless the book with their gracious presence. And that is the sheer privilege for me. I think I am feeling just overwhelmed. I can't express it in words.
All the best, Mukul. All the best. Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah.
And stay
Thank you, Mukul.
Stay safe.
Thank you, Payel.
More poems from you. More poems from you.
Wonderfully well.
Sure. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, viewers. And I hope you have enjoyed the journey of the launch of this book, though it was a virtual one. That is what the present situation demands. And do buy the book. It is available in Amazon. Thanks to all of you for viewing this. And I bid good night to all of you. Stay well, stay safe, stay happy. Thank you so much. Namaskar.